Hello all and welcome to this event on how the Ministry of Justice intends their probation reforms to meet the needs of Black and minority ethnic people and to involve Black and minority ethnic-led and specialist organisations in doing that. My name's Jess Mullen. I'm Director of Influence and Communications at Clinks, and I'm also our strategic lead for our work in tackling race inequality in the criminal justice system. Before we begin, I just want to say a few words about language. We acknowledge that the term Black and minority ethnic can be problematic and that others choose to use other terms to describe their ethnicity and cultural background. We know it's problematic and refers to a group of people who are far from homogenous, and that the intersection of race, ethnicity, faith and culture makes social identities multifaceted and shifting, and that as a result, experiences and needs of people within the term BAME will vary hugely. Wherever possible in our work, we do always try to talk about specific groups of people, but we also do use the term BAME, albeit reluctantly, because we feel that at times it's useful to describe the collective inequality and discrimination that's experienced across certain groups. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Clinks, we are the membership organisation for the voluntary sector working in criminal justice. We have 500 members working across prisons and probation, in communities, in the youth estate, and also working to prevent and divert people from getting involved in the criminal justice system in the first place. And our work on race inequality goes back many years. Before I joined Clinks, which was 9 years ago, that work was ongoing. And we've always undertaken that work in partnership with and as an ally to Black and minority ethnic-led organisations. At Clinks, we're very clear that we don't do what others do. There's enough work to go around without the need to duplicate. So we aim to work in partnership and add value to others' work and bring our criminal justice knowledge and expertise to the work of others and expertise on race inequality. The most recent phase of our activity around race inequality has been our partnership with the Black Training and Enterprise Group that goes back to 2012 in our work to lead the Young Review, which was published in 2014, and then subsequently to ensure that organisations like yours were able to feed into the LAMI Review, which followed the Young Review. And we've since been working with many organisations in the sector to push for the implementation of the recommendations from both those reviews. We have also very recently committed to becoming an anti-racist organisation in all that we say and do, and extending our work to influence in this area to the other areas of our work across the organisation. So before we continue, I just want to cover a few housekeeping points and to give an overview of how the session is going to work and what we will cover. So we're recording the session so that we can share it on our website for others who haven't been able to make this. And for this reason, you're all set on mute and have your video off. And we'll also be keeping a record of any questions you ask and discussion points you make. And we'll be following those up, both in our own work and feeding them back to the Ministry of Justice, who are also on the call. So when we come to the question and answer sessions, please can you use the chat function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen, and that will help us to record everything that's said. In terms of the agenda today, what we're going to cover is, firstly, I'm going to provide an introduction to the new probation model. It's going to be very, very top level. And then I'm going to move on to talk about how MOJ and HMPPS intend to ensure that the needs of Black and minority ethnic service users are met. And then at the end of that bit, we'll stop for some questions and answers and some discussion. Then we'll have a comfort break, and then I will move on to look at the commissioning process and procurement of services to work alongside probation services and what opportunities there are within that for Black and minority ethnic-led and specialist organisations. And then we'll have another Q&A and discussion. We've built in quite a lot of time for the Q&A and discussion. And if we don't need that time, that means we'll just finish earlier and you'll all get some of your day back. Okay, so the new probation model. In July 2018, the Ministry of Justice announced that they would be ending the contracts for community rehabilitation companies. These are the companies that are currently responsible for offender management of low to medium risk offenders and who many voluntary sector organisations have subcontracts with to provide support services. And the Ministry of Justice announced that those contracts would end early. And that was in response to increasing concern that the system wasn't really working. We ourselves had highlighted that it led to the voluntary sector being underfunded, underrepresented and under-resourced in the delivery of services to people under probation and supervision. And the LAMI review had noted that very few Black and minority-led organisations were present in the CRC supply chains. And in fact, from CLINC's data, we don't know of any Black and minority ethnic-led organisations that are in those supply chains. And the Chief Inspector of Probation described the system as irredeemably flawed. So we therefore very much welcomed the consultation that was held on the development of a new model. And in May 2019, the government published the outcome of that consultation. And we've since seen a number of documents that provide more detail, most recently the draft target operating model that was published in March. And a very, very top level summary of what those documents say, and I mean incredibly top level. They're many pages long and I've boiled them down to 4 bullet points. But essentially, all offender management is to be unified under one single national probation service that will be a public sector organisation from spring 2021. So this ends the split between the National Probation Service having responsibility for high risk people and community rehabilitation companies having responsibility for low to medium risk people. The new National Probation Service will be organised into 11 areas in England and 1 additional distinct area to cover the whole of Wales. And each of those areas will have a regional probation director who will provide strategic leadership in the area and be responsible for the delivery and commissioning of probation services. And there is a clear stated commitment throughout all of the documents to the role of the voluntary sector in working alongside the probation service. But it's also important to say that it's not just limited solely to the voluntary sector, and there's also the potential that private companies could be involved in delivering the services. So just to give you an idea, these are the new National Probation Service areas that will be established from next year. As you'll see, they're quite large, and within them there are, in some cases, multiple police and crime commissioner areas and of course multiple local authorities. But what they don't do anywhere is intersect those areas. So while there are other areas within them, they don't sort of cut through the middle of any of them. And under the new model, the current model whereby through the gate services to support people transitioning from prison into the community are provided by community rehabilitation companies and then subcontracted partners who are often in the voluntary sector, that's going to change. And the intention for this is to provide better continuity through the gate so that when a person has less than 10 months left to serve, a community-based responsible officer from the MPS becomes responsible for their rehabilitation and resettlement and refers them to relevant services. And the idea for that is that the responsible officer who will in-reach into the prison before they're released should also be the responsible officer on release. For those with more than 10 months to serve, the offender management and custody model will be responsible for their rehabilitation and resettlement in prison. So as I've said before, the public sector the public sector probation service will be responsible for everyone under probation supervision, whether that's post-custody or those that are serving community sentences. And the main opportunity for the voluntary sector is in the dynamic framework for rehabilitation and resettlement services. So this is a commissioning framework on which organisations can register and bid for opportunities as they arise. And I'm going to go into more detail about that in the second half of the event. But through this, rehabilitation activity requirements, resettlement interventions, and non-sentence desistance interventions will be delivered. There will also be a regional outcomes fund established, and the aim of that is that it will be a pot of money to support the commissioning of non-sentence delivery services. So services that might support people's longer term outcomes, services that might address multiple and complex needs, the sort of wider, bigger stuff that isn't directly linked to someone's sentence and reoffending in the short term. So I'm going to move on to talk about how the Ministry of Justice and HMPPS intend to ensure that Black and minority ethnic service users' needs are met. The latest iteration of the target operating model for the new probation service was published in March. So this is the document that basically outlines what the new service will look like. It's still a draft, and the final version is expected to be published in the new year. So there is still opportunity to influence it to some extent. A lot has been finalised, but not everything at this stage. And the probation review team are currently commissioning workshops with Black and minority ethnic people with lived experience of probation in order to check and challenge the commitments the document makes in relation to addressing race inequality. So I'm just going to talk through those key commitments, and then we have some space for questions, but also discussion and feedback. And you might want to have these questions in your mind as I go through the slides, because it would be interesting to think about these for the discussion. I'll put them back up afterwards as well. So we're really pleased that the Regional Probation Director in each of those 12 areas on the map I showed earlier will have overall strategic responsibility for meeting the relevant recommendations of the LAMI review. But we are quite concerned because the reference to the recommendations of the LAMI review, the LAMI review recommendations in themselves are quite narrow and very specific to the current probation model. So we're really keen to see that in future, the spirit of the LAMI review, as well as the letter of it, is pursued by regional probation directors. There will also be a creation of a dedicated equalities manager in each area, which we're also pleased to see that dedicated resource. And we are really keen for that to be at a sufficiently senior level. There's explicit recognition in the target operating model of the overrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic people in custody, of the high referrals to unpaid work and low referrals to accredited programs for these groups. And the target operating model talks about actively building safeguards to ensure that advice to sentences in no way reflects biased or negative stereotypes associated with ethnic background. And in support of that, it commits to rigorous data collection and the principle of explain or reform, which was recommended by the LAMI review, so that key probation processes can be monitored for racial disparities, analysed, and that analysis be made public. And we're really welcoming of that commitment to transparency, and also hope to see opportunities for people outside of the system to raise concern about disparities that they believe should be explained or reformed. There are some specific commitments around advice to the courts, and we're pleased to see that. So the National Probation Service will retain responsibility for advising the courts on sentencing, as it currently does. But we're really pleased to see that concerns around racial stereotyping impacting that advice and decision making at sentencing stage are being taken on board. Because as we know, there are significant sentencing disparities for certain groups of people within the Black and minority ethnic category. Key consideration has been given to improve the provision and quality of pre-sentence reports. And this is to ensure that sentences are better informed of an individual's circumstances and sentencing options through unbiased and clear advice to improve sentencer confidence in community options. There's commitment for additional resource for pre-sentence reports, particularly for women and Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. And that resource is yet to be confirmed. And Clinks, we've said that we're quite keen to see a percentage target for the number of pre-sentence reports that are written for these groups, because that allows reports to be given in a fuller way. Okay. Sorry, I'm operating two screens, and it means I have to coordinate clicking on both of them, which is harder than you would think. So the next section after the Q&A and discussion will go into the procurement process in more detail. But I wanted to give a brief overview at this stage, as it's an important part of the picture. However, I would ask that any questions around this, maybe hold on to them until the second part, because the second part might actually answer your questions on procurement and commissioning. But just as an overview, organisations that want to provide resettlement and rehabilitation services alongside the National Probation Service will have to set out equalities commitments in their bids, and those commitments will be contractualised to hold them to account. And the commissioning process allows for the commissioning of services to specific cohorts, and the target operating model recognises specifically that the voluntary sector includes organisations with relevant expertise and experience in meeting the needs of those cohorts. So that's the first lot of presentations done. We're going to move to your questions. We've got colleagues from the Ministry of Justice here who can answer any questions that I can't. And if neither us or them at this stage can answer your questions, we'll take them away and come back to you. And we're also really interested to hear your views on, do these commitments go far enough? And what more would you like to see to address race inequality in the criminal justice system that particularly could be done by the probation service? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see you all, and invite people to put any questions or discussion points in the chat, and then I'll come to you to ask those questions. Okay, first question, Whitney. You can unmute yourself and ask it, or I can read it out for you.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks. Nice to see you.
I will probably have a range of different questions, but I would like to start with, how is cultural competence going to be assessed? And who is going to be doing that assessing as well?
I think that's a very good point. It links to a large extent to some of the slides in the later session, but I just wonder whether, is there anyone from MOJ who wants to give an initial response? Maybe we'll get into more discussion later on.
Sorry, Jess, sorry, I was being incompetent. Zoom being not my most familiar one to be using.
That's okay. Sue, do you want to just introduce yourself so that everyone knows who you are?
Yeah, so I'm Sue Leeming, and I'm co-leading the Dynamic Framework competition with Janet Phillipson, who's also on the line, and I've been largely responsible for the service design element. So it is a really good question, and I think it's something that I would be very happy to get thoughts and views on from this group. So where we're, Jess, can I just give 2 minutes on where we are with the various competitions, because then that will land. That will sort of be a little, or will that be captured in the second session?
Yeah, I've got some slides on that in the second section. So
okay, in that case,
okay. So
yeah, no, that's really fine.
Without that.
So I think what I would, in that case, what I'll simply say, and we can explore this later. We have not yet finalised the guide. So in terms of the evaluation criteria for the competitions, we are at this stage simply asking providers how they will demonstrate an ability to meet the requirements and the specifications in relation to BAME amongst other cohorts. And we have called out, as Jess has referenced, within that particular elements of the LAMI report. And so cultural competence is one of those. But what we haven't done is finalise the guidance, et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely space and capacity, and this would be a good moment, although everything's always at pace with us. Well, it's kind of at pace, doesn't it? Feel like it's pace. It probably feels like the opposite sometimes your side, but putting that aside, the headline uses thoughts and views of this group into how we can effectively evaluate and providers' ability to meet those requirements would be super welcome.
Shall we, I've noted it down, there's a couple of slides that relate to it in the second section, so maybe we'll make sure we come back to it in the discussion after that.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Great. Yeah, so I'll pause there, but thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Sue. Peter, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks everybody. So yeah, my name is Peter. I'm the CEO of an organisation called Support When It Matters, or SWIM, and we deliver specifically culturally sensitive psychosocial interventions to older Black men who are still engaged or finding it difficult to come out of the criminal justice system. And I was very interested with some of the the activities and the aspirations, Jess, that are being planned for, but there seemed to be what felt like to me, and hopefully you'll be able to explain this, a bit of a gap in the area of around unconscious bias within the existing structure and the existing individuals. Now, bearing in mind that it's going to be the same individuals who are in post come spring 2021 that are in post now. So for me, there is something significant that needs to be really thought about in order to bring about a change in attitude and outlook within individuals. Now, the great news is that some organisations that we're working with have taken that on board already, and we are supporting them to bring about, or to at least start off, the unpicking, you know, the intricate sort of nuances within that issues of unconscious bias. And so that's just really what I wanted to bring up, really.
Thanks, Peter. I think absolutely. I think, you know, there's some very good starting points here with, you know, language that actually recognises discrimination and stereotypes probably for the first time, and also recognition of particular processes that cause unequal outcomes. But there's also a point about staff training and how we deal with that. I know there's lots of work in the probation programme around the professionalisation of the service and staff. Does someone from MOJ want to respond to that?
Jess, I can.
Brilliant, thanks, Abby.
Kind of help. So the probation workforce programme is kind of the sister programme to the reform programme, which is looking specifically at how we can kind of improve and support our workforce better. And I know that within that there's a specific focus on training that staff will receive. And I also know that towards the end of this year, they are planning to release their diversity and inclusion strategy. That's about the limit of what I know, but I know that those two things exist. So I'm more than happy to ask for more information specifically on unconscious bias training and feed that back to Jess if that's helpful.
And the other thing I would say, through Clinks and others, some of who are in this group, so we sit on the external advice and scrutiny panel to HMPPS, which is for the implementation of the LAMI review recommendations. And we have, for many years now, I don't know when I want to go back and say when it was, because it's a bit depressing, but we have been arguing and offering that the voluntary sector should be utilised to provide some of that training and support. And we will continue to make that offer and make that point. We have made it with subsequent ministers, and it has, with ministers, I think, there has been recognition given to it, but we're not at the point where it's actually, we've got any further with it being implemented, and we will continue, and partly through the work that Abby's just talked about, we will seek to influence that. Temba, you've added something about BME involvement as service providers. Was that a question about how BME-led organisations can be involved in actually providing services?
Well, it's actually a question about that, but specifically, I wanted to avoid making it a bit longer than it should be. And I thought it would be easier for me to just, ask the question. What we do find is through the LAMI review and a lot of other reviews is that there has been great work that identifies a lot of inequalities and disparities in the services that are being provided to BAME community. What we don't have, or what we actually don't measure, is the number of inequalities and disparities of BAME organizations that are involved in trying to address these BAME issues. Now, my organization, UKCJS, I'm the CEO. What we look at are disparities and inequalities of services that are being provided to the BAME community, and quantify them really as well as tracking the problem back to the community. So we start off from you know, the probation or the prison service, and then we track that problem back to the community, so we can start to identify through data what are the common problems that are being faced that are resulting in the overrepresentation of BAME community within the criminal justice system. Now, my question is, having gone through the dynamic framework myself, I found the document very much geared towards supporting organizations that are well established. And if we go back to the history that we're talking about, inequalities, disparities, there's no chance that BAME would be ever get into that space and start providing services. I attempted to do so. I didn't make it as a bidder, didn't get any feedback as well. But interesting enough is that some of the, I suppose I don't want to mix things, because I was going to talk specifically about specific issues that are in there that really discriminate against BAME providers. But all I can say is there is a lot of work that needs to be done if we are actually going to get BAME themselves taking part in that space. At the moment, I haven't done any data collection, but I can imagine that there is a disproportionate representation of BAME providers within the framework, dynamic framework itself.
No, absolutely. And so we know that in the current model, we don't know of any BAME providers delivering through CRC contracts, which is obviously hugely concerning. And one of the things that we have, you're not the first to talk about the challenges and feeling that the complexity of qualifying for the dynamic framework. And we've been gathering that information from the sector to try and feed it back to the Ministry of Justice and make that point. So really interested to talk to you a bit more about that, because we are equally concerned that small and specialist providers have more barriers to participating in the commissioning framework, which for everyone else we will talk more about in the next section, and I'll talk about some of those challenges as well, and also some of the opportunities that there might be for getting involved. The other thing we've been really clear on is for most of the services that are being commissioned, we would like to see a situation where grants are the default option over contracts, because we think that gives more access to small specialist organisations and is easier for organisations to engage with. We particularly think grants need to be used in the commissioning of services for BAME services from small and specialist organisations, because it just makes the process more flexible and easier for organisations to access. And we've been feeding back the data and information we have about the fact that actually Black and minority-led organisations in our sector tend to be much more vulnerable, much less financially sustainable, hold lower reserves, have been impacted by the historic funding cuts in a disproportionate way. And we're feeding that information back to the MOJ because we too are concerned about this, but we'll come on to talk about it a little bit more. But also very interested to hear more from my point of view about your experience of the dynamic framework for our work to feed back, but also so that MOJ colleagues can hear more about that. Thank you. Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions and I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to try and get through. And apologies if I pronounce names incorrect, please correct me if I do. So Sibusiso?
Yes, hi,
Hello.
can you hear me?
Did I say that correctly?
Oh, you're
No.
right, you're right, okay.
How should I have said it?
No, you're right.
I was right, okay, brilliant.
Yeah, so we've tried to work with Lay Hill and also what's the name in Bristol? Even forgot them. But we found that they just took us just around the bends for over a year of conversations with the senior team. And mainly the way we work is we want to bring those with previous convictions, ex-offenders, to work with current offenders, so that it's real to real, not bringing, moonshine, goodwill, intention people to aim to understand the issues that an ex-offender or an offender is currently dealing with. They like the model, but really, I think getting to the commissioning part was just, a whole year of planning, programming, meeting, discussion, look at this, look at that, a whole year. So you can imagine our time invested in all of this, right? And raising all the offenders' ambitions of, we're coming in, we're going to do this, and in the community, and then imagine what fools we look like afterwards, right? So I'm happy that this is finally, kind of taking fruit. But I think that the commissioning service or the probation service has caused a lot of scars with people that have always wanted to engage with it, because you have such a large pool of Black men and within your services, but yet you don't have any Black service providers. The contradiction is just so vast that it then seems like the business of criminal justice. So what I wanted to check, my main question is really about the people with lived experience. So when going through the vetting, we found that those that had previous convictions really didn't want to go through that vetting because it really was asking a lot. Fine to do it, but other people are not fine, and therefore it prevented them from going into the prisons to deliver those services. I think it's like, if it's over 3 weeks, then you need to do the vetting. That's one. And in regards to procurement, and for those that are really struggling with that issue, we've tried to solve this problem. We've tried to solve this problem. So we've got a bid writing team, and this is part of the Bi-Social Corporate Challenge. So if this service could sign up to the Bi-Social Corporate Challenge, which is supporting supply chains to procure from social enterprises and the voluntary sector, what we then do is we can support the voluntary sector with bid writing and winning some of those tenders, or creating consortiums. We've got some videos that we've done already with other contractors, so to be great, and making easier processes of partnering with tier ones in construction, which we've got partners with Wilmot Dixon and Scape, just to make sure that should this opportunity come back again, we can then actually, move an offender, provide them, some training, and actually provide them future jobs within the construction industry or procurement, if that is something that they were looking at. So, I think through that rejection, we've gone back and still developed our process in what we wanted to do. So this really does sound exciting. I hope it's not a whole administrative process that's just too deep, puts people off. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you if you've got a link to the bid writing stuff, if you stick it in the comments, and then people might be able to follow up and find it.
Sure.
Just on the vetting stuff, this is an issue that raises its head often, and I think it's an interesting issue because it's an issue across all services, whether we're talking BME specialist or not, with regards to people with lived experience. Although I think there's an added issue potentially that was explored somewhat when we were working on the Young Review, which was that we had feedback from organisations that when they submitted people with foreign names to the vetting process, they found that it took longer to get responses back. And we tried to investigate that and discovered that there was no equality monitoring happening of the vetting process. So there was no way of actually telling whether there was an issue in that or not. And it remains something that hasn't been resolved. It's obviously an issue, particularly going into prisons. I just wonder, anyone from the probation review team, in terms of vetting and issues with working with people with lived experience and people with lived experience delivering services in the probation space, is there anything you can say about that?
I can't say a huge amount. I think we're looking at it. We're looking at it again in relation to the number 10 targets of prison leavers getting into employment and training. This isn't directly relevant to this conversation, but it absolutely, and we are currently exploring the extent to which dynamic framework competitions can support that. It is complex, it is tricky, our side, and I'm not, evidently that is the case. But that activity of seeing if there is capacity to align any of the dynamic framework competitions with that broad number 10 target is requiring us to refocus on what is sensibly achievable, and clearly the existing policy frameworks, vetting, etc., in relation to vetting are there, and they are our current attempt to explain what the options are to try and enable people to deliver services either in custody or in the community. But I think probably, I don't think I've got anything more particular additional to say that in relation to that issue, but to acknowledge that it is one of the more challenging ones.
Yeah, just to add.
That's helpful, Sue. I mean, helpful. Just sorry, go on, Janet.
Well, yeah. So I know there is being work done to look at how we make it easier for people with lived experience to come into the workforce, both because there are some people who are in the CRCs at the moment who might be in scope to transfer to MPS, and more generally, but I don't have the latest on where that work is up to, I'm afraid, but we can find out.
Okay, we'll try and get that information and share it. And I suppose also my reflection on what Sue said was, there are things happening like the number 10 target of getting more people into work that actually provide potential sort of policy levers and opportunities for us in the voluntary sector to try and progress this agenda a bit further.
And I think it's also quite surprising to see how the Avon and Somerset, or the police themselves, in terms of the amount of commissions that they have in their own procurements, and when you see the reoffending rates, that they don't even hire ex-offenders. They don't even hire ex-offenders, but they want the reoffending rates to reduce. So I think you need to do something more within the police services to make sure that they've got 40% of ex-offenders need to be on their sites or something. It doesn't make any sense.
And there's definitely something about the joining up across different criminal justice agencies of having something coherent rather than different approaches. Whitney, you've got a question about structural changes around structural violence and how the MPS works to become anti-racist.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to think about here is some of the issues that we've come across kind of working in the prison estate and how they might then relate to this piece of work. So I'm thinking about, I'm hearing that there is training going on with staff around unconscious bias, and that's a step in the right direction. But I'm also very interested in how the systems can actually generate violence, or the systems themselves can kind of perpetrate acts of racism, and how that's going to be monitored throughout this piece of work. Because I'm thinking about how actually if systems are targeting particular groups of people, how that can then affect service delivery and have a ripple effect on this, like the outcomes and the targets. So when we're trying to kind of we work with young people, so if we're working with young people, but then they're kind of systematically getting recalled quite a lot, so therefore, how does that affect our work with them directly, but then also how does it affect our kind of targets and outcomes as a service delivery? So I'm very interested to understand what NPS are doing to also think about their own systems and what's in place, which might kind of perpetuate violence or perpetuate kind of racist stereotypes and these kind of things, how that might then intersect with service delivery, and how we will be able to raise issues or raise concerns as we're delivering, and like who will we speak to it to ensure that these things are being picked up and these changes are not just being made kind of with our internal thinking, but also our internal systems and procedures.
Yeah, and I think that it links to your previous point as well, because one of the things we've been saying is that any definition of cultural competence needs to include a recognition of the impact of structural racism, because the two things are inextricably linked. But if you have a definition of cultural competence that doesn't include that, then it's going to lead to all of the issues you're talking about. Does anyone from MOJ want to respond to Whitney's point about that, and also about how organisations either delivering alongside probation or working independently external to the service can sort of feed in and raise those kinds of issues?
I can have a go at answering some of that, but aware that it's probably quite a broad discussion point. I think first of all, the training aspect that we spoke about earlier is something that I need to do a little bit more digging on with the workforce programme, and potentially I was going to suggest to Jess that we have a conversation similar to this around the training again, but with more organisations involved as well. Also,
I'd be very happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that might be helpful. I also know that as part of the unified model, we're developing an equalities monitoring tool, which will be able to produce data on disproportionality by ethnicity and other characteristics as well on key aspects of service delivery, which is a good starting point, but also conscious that just having lots of data isn't necessarily helpful. It's what we do with that data. So I'm currently, sorry, I feel like I'm jumping around a bit here, but I'm also currently looking at kind of the structure within the new MPS regions for equalities support, and what that equalities team looks like, and what the scope of that team will be, and the interactions that they may be able to have with providers to raise those kinds of points. I hadn't thought about that up until this stage. We're still quite in the early stages of that design and getting that extra resource potentially signed off. But it's definitely something that would be good to speak to you about more, about what would be for the voluntary sector an easy route in to have those conversations that's not too kind of burdensome or the onus is on you, but how we can use the equalities monitoring tool and feedback from partner organisations to make sure that we're doing something useful with that data.
Brilliant, thanks Abby, and I think we'll definitely take you up on those offers and probably draw in a conversation rather than an answer. But I think there's a few tools that we can look at to try and address that better than we currently do. So really happy to have those conversations. Great, thank you. There's a few more questions, but I'm going to suggest that I pause them and ask people to hold on to them, because they're related to things that are going to be covered in the next set of slides. And therefore, once I do those slides, you may still have that question, or you may have a slightly different question. So I'm going to suggest we just wait a second and come back to those in the next Q&A, if that's okay with everyone. And then I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Here we are. Okay. Can everyone see that again? Is that back on your screens? Oh, you're all on mute and you can't tell me. Give me a thumbs up. Yeah, cool, thank you. Okay, so my computer's not moving the slide on. Here we go. So the next part of the event focuses on the procurement process for rehabilitation and resettlement services that will be delivered and will be delivering support alongside the probation service, and the potential opportunities for organisations like yours to be involved, and also how those commissioned services will be required to meet the needs of Black and minority ethnic people. So these services will be commissioned through what is known as the dynamic framework. And the dynamic framework is the systems through which Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service will procure, or to use simpler, straightforward language, by rehabilitation and resettlement services. And organisations can qualify onto the dynamic framework in order to be able to bid or apply for contracts or grants to deliver rehabilitation and resettlement services in the future. Now, it's important that I just make the point here that clinks are strongly advocating that grants should be part of the commissioning options for these services. But at the moment, everything that is out is a contract. But we're hoping to see more grants in the future. Whether that hope will be realised remains to be seen. So to qualify onto the framework, organisations will need to demonstrate expertise in the relevant service area and say which geographical areas they're interested in working in. And you can qualify at any time, but to then be invited to bid or apply for a contract or grant, you will have needed to have qualified in advance of it being announced. However, if you haven't qualified at the time the invitation is announced, you can still do this and then submit a bid, but as long as it's before the deadline for those bids. And HMPPS can commission through the framework, the regional probation directors can commission through the framework, but so can other commissioners. So there is quite a high possibility that in the future, police and crime commissioners, local authorities, other criminal justice or criminal justice related commissioning might go through the dynamic framework. However, regional probation directors are also able to commission through other systems and processes. And it's important to note that because that is what is happening in Greater Manchester. Greater Manchester are commissioning separately at the moment from the central services that are being commissioned by HMPPS. And if you work in Greater Manchester and want to know more about that, we are going to be holding an event. It was scheduled but had to be postponed, and so keep an eye out for details of that, which will give more information. So qualification is the process by which organisations apply to be on the framework, essentially, and it's intended to be a relatively light touch process. But as we've already heard, we are concerned that some organisations are finding it quite complex. But essentially what it intends to do is allow you to demonstrate your experience and provide case studies relevant to the need area that you're interested in delivering to, and answer a standard selection criteria. As part of the process, you have to accept the standard framework agreement, which contains various terms and conditions which then apply to any contracts or grants awarded under the framework. And organisations who submit bids but are unsuccessful in their qualification should receive feedback and have 2 additional attempts then to qualify. So it was interesting to hear that you hadn't managed to qualify. I can't remember who'd said that, but one person said they hadn't, and that you hadn't received feedback. And if that's the case, you should have got feedback. So it's worth following that up, and do get in touch if you need help in doing that. So these are the categories of service user needs that have been identified and for which services will be commissioned to meet those needs through the framework. As you'll see, they don't describe activity, but they describe the needs of people under probation supervision. And there's more than £100 million a year available to fund the delivery of these services. Although it's likely that less will be spent in the first year as the new system gets up and running. And it's important to say that the framework will exist for 7 years and is extendable for 3 years. So even if this isn't potentially an opportunity for you now, there might be opportunities in the future, and it's worth qualifying and getting on the system. So not all the need areas will be commissioned centrally by HMPPS as services to be delivered from day 1 of the new model. And the areas highlighted in bold are the needs for which services will be commissioned to begin from June 2021. And that commissioning process is currently underway. So the timetable for that commissioning process is underway and is very tight. And in fact, as people have alluded to, people are already trying to get on and bid for some services. So the deadlines for bidding for education, training and employment, if you haven't already qualified, you're probably too late. In fact, sorry, you are. The deadline was the 7th of September. For accommodation, the deadline is the 28th of September, so very soon. For personal well-being, it's the 19th of October, and for women's services, it's the 9th of November. And sorry, I should say personal well-being includes family and significant others, lifestyle and associates, emotional well-being, and social inclusion. But if you're interested in one of those areas for which the deadline has already passed, and those deadlines are all on our website if you need to look at them again, there is still potential to partner with another organisation that has qualified and essentially be part of their supply chain. So for all of those day one services that are being commissioned, there are equalities commitments that will form part of the procurement process, and they will then be contractualised so providers can be held to account. And this slide shows the requirements that bidders need to meet with regards to meeting the needs of Black and minority ethnic people. Now, from Clink's point of view, we're clear that BAME-led and specialist organisations have an advantage in meeting these requirements. But we are conscious that there are huge complexities in how you assess whether people meet these needs. And particularly if Black and minority-led organisations are competing against other organisations who have huge bid teams and resources to respond to these kinds of requirements. We're really keen to think about how these are evaluated to make sure that the right people have an advantage in meeting these things. And a number of the questions that we've raised about this have already been raised by some of you. So, for instance, how will it be assessed that people understand the additional and specific needs of Black and minority ethnic people? You know, that will certainly require the need to show an understanding of the diversity of experience within that category, because obviously the needs of a Muslim woman or a young Black man or a Gypsy traveller Roma man are all going to be significantly different. So it's quite difficult to talk about BAME needs. We're also interested in what the definition of cultural competence that will be used by assessors will be. And we're really keen to think about actually in the assessment, does being a BAME-led or specialist organisation or working in true partnership with a BAME-led or specialist organisation, could that be part of the evaluation criteria that would mean you would score higher? So beyond day one services, you will have all seen on the list of services that there is a BAME service category, which will enable the commissioning of specialist services. But there is still a lot about that is unclear, and I think still scope to influence that and feed into it. So we're really interested for you to be able to give your views on this here. So obviously, as you know, I've already talked about, a BAME service category in many ways doesn't make a huge amount of sense. What you need is a service category that is flexible enough to allow services to be commissioned that meet the specific needs of the different groups of people that make up the term BAME. And in doing so, we really strongly feel that the experience and expertise of BAME-led organisations should be given preference. But we're also conscious that that can be in tension with procurement rules. And we also, as I've said already, we strongly believe that grants should be used to commission these services, because we think that will remove the barriers to Black and minority-led organisations actually having a level playing field to get in and deliver these services. The other thing to say is it's currently unclear when regional probation directors would choose to commission these services, and it's at the discretion of regional probation directors to do so. The idea is that they will commission further services to meet need in their local areas, and we would hope that would mean that in areas with high levels of diversity and high levels of disproportionality in the criminal justice system, we would be seeing these services commissioned very, very soon. But we're also concerned that there might be areas where actually there are small numbers of people, but that doesn't mean that amongst those people there isn't a high level of need for these services. So while we don't know when they will be commissioned, it's definitely worth qualifying onto the framework in preparation for this. Sorry, I have lost where I am in one set of slides. Here we are. So just in summary, the opportunities to deliver services alongside the future probation service include qualifying onto the framework and bidding to deliver day one services, partnering with another organisation who's qualified to bid, qualified in order to be able to bid to deliver day one services, and qualifying now in order to bid to deliver services beyond day one, which includes the BAME service category. In order to do that, so in order to qualify onto the framework, this slide gives you the instructions of what you need to do. You need to go onto the MOJ e-sourcing portal. I'm not going to go through this in detail now, but we will circulate the slides so you have the details of how to do that. If you are thinking, oh, actually, we really possibly could deliver, for instance, employment training and education services, and we've missed that boat, and what do we do now? And you might want to work in partnership, you could think about a couple of things. So the MOJ have published on the e-sourcing portal all the organisations that have qualified to bid for that call off, and you could maybe look at that list, see if there's any organisations you already have relationships with, think about possibly getting into partnership with them. Clinks has also been holding events with potential prime providers of these services, and we have a list of those primes, and those events are ongoing. What we're really trying to do is give the voluntary sector in those events an opportunity to ask the primes what their approach will be, what their approach to partnership will be, what their approach to equalities will be, and get some of those answers. So if you're interested, let us know and we can circulate the information about that as well. And then finally, I just wanted to say a word on market stewardship in relation to primes and entering into partnerships. We know that in the past, BAME organisations have had significantly negative experience of being in supply chains and subcontracting, often being used as big candy to not then actually get any of the work or any funds. And we have fed back many of these issues to the Ministry of Justice and have been pleased to see that a number of the supply chain protections we've advocated for have been taken on board. So there are protections to stop people being used as big candy. If a supplier names a key subcontractor in their bid, then they have to actually inform MOJ if that changes. And there's also a preclusion against subcontractors, against requiring subcontractors to enter into exclusivity agreements, whereby you can only be in one person's bid, and then if that doesn't come through, you've lost out on other opportunities. It is important to say that that protection around big candy is specifically for key subcontractors, and therefore we are a little concerned that if you are playing a very small role in the supply chain, the same thing might happen. So just wanted to flag that. And finally, suppliers will also be required to annually report on their supply chains. And that will actually give us that transparency we were talking about before, because at the moment we don't know for definite if there are any BAME organisations in supply chains. Clinks has data that we don't think there are any, but that's just what we've been told. There isn't actually a list published anywhere of who's in the supply chains, but in the future there will be. So I'm going to stop there again, and we're going to have some more time for questions and also comments and thoughts. And in terms of discussion, what we're particularly interested in, and I think would be good for MOJ colleagues to hear, and relates to some of the questions that I put on hold in the last Q&A session, is do you have any thoughts on how to assess whether bidders meet those equality requirements? And do you have any thoughts on the service specification for BAME services? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm just going to go back to the chat and find Des. You had, the chat's got really long. Des, you had a question about the point about there not being any BME organisations in current supply chains, and the intention from MOJ to change that and improve that. Have those slides answered that, and do you have any follow-up question to it?
Yeah, it doesn't really answer it, although I think it highlights it. It'd be good to hear from the MOJ what their thoughts are in being able to address that. And also just being clear on whether a BAME-led organisation is about the trustee stroke management board being 50% BAME, etc. And just kind of spinning off from that, because I've got the opportunity when we talk about with HMPPS or the MOJ looking at cultural competence, again, more of a rhetorical question: how many people on their board, or how many people that are thinking about this and discussing this, are people of colour or are BAME? Because I think that helps, because there's a specific lens that one needs to look through. Otherwise, I think it becomes very academic, and it can become, yeah, I think more academic than it is actually lived out, which is really important when you're looking to try and address issues of systemic racism. So two
Brilliant,
questions.
thanks, Ted. Is it two? I wrote down three.
All right, go with three.
Does anyone from MOJ want to come in on, so I guess that point about, is there a clear intention that BAME-led organisations with that expertise and experience are enabled to be involved? What do we mean by BAME-led organisations? What is the definition, if that is an intention? How do we define them? And in discussions of cultural competence, who's involved in those discussions, and how many of those people are from BAME backgrounds themselves?
So I'll try and pick up some of those points. Hopefully another colleague with it will come in on some of the other points. In terms of the intention to involve more BAME-led organisations, so I think we need to be careful around what the procurement rules are. In general, we can't say, you know, we will favour one type of organisation over another. It has to be, certainly in terms of running a competition, you know, it has to be on the basis of, here are our criteria, here are the services that we want, who provides the best response around how you will meet those service requirements. Where there is a difference and there is more flexibility, I think, is around providing support to organisations so that they get to the level they need to in order to be able to answer the competitions. So certainly what we're really keen to hear from you in this kind of session and afterwards is, what support do you think you need to be able to engage in the competition? So for instance, we know that for smaller organisations more widely, areas such as the information security and information assurance and data protection are problematic because you need accreditation and so on. So we've been running sessions, and I know I've seen from the list that there is some crossover of who's on this session and I think a later session today about information assurance. We are running sessions to help explain that, and again to find out what more support do you need, and that kind of support can be focused to those who are voluntary sector, those who have perhaps turnover under a certain amount, so that we can focus the support where it's needed and kind of bring people up to a level playing field. When we get to the competition stage, we have to have that level playing field, because it's just not fair. We can't really do anything different, but we can work before the competition stage to try and help people get to that level. So yeah, I mean, we're really keen to hear from you what specific support would help you to be able to engage in the competitions, but we are definitely keen that you can do so. Abby or Sue, do you want to come in on some of the other points?
Yeah, there's quite a lot that's been captured. So Jess, if there's other ones that we need to come back to that we don't pick up. I mean, I guess so. Just to so the ones that struck me were in terms of the overall kind of definition of the service categories and the future intent. there's no question that going forward there is an opportunity for considerable variety of commissioning of services by BAME-led organisations. The overall outcomes at the framework level are extremely broad, with absolutely that intent in mind. And I'm trying to think about how to say the next point without sounding apologist. So that's but I suppose a simple point I would like to make from our kind of service design perspective is that we are launching this framework. We have an intent to ameliorate some of the lack of success that Jess referred to in relation to TR. So our kind of first base is, can we get some decent day one services that meet the most frequently occurring rehabilitative needs? The dynamic framework obviously is just the commercial vehicle. By attempting to slightly future-proof it with those broad categories, we are seeing this as an incremental, we are adopting an incremental approach. We have had to have ambition of a certain size for day one, and anyone who's been alongside us for any of these events will be fully cognizant with the challenges even to give bidders enough time to mobilise for day one. So there is I suppose in summary what I'm saying is we know that we will only get so far with these day one services. The issue about grants is huge and massive, and I'm be amazed if we don't start using grants as post day one commissioning. The only simple point I would like to make is these day one services are enforceable appointments which are part of sentence management. With that comes, and anyone who looks at the specifications will see there's something like 22 general requirements which are all about mandated activity, about exchange of information, and are linked to criminal justice stuff. There are lots of issues clearly in relation to why grants would be a good thing. We did weigh this up, and we've had consistent feedback from clinics and others about this. It just doesn't look that it stacks up for those type of services, but that absolutely shouldn't be seen as any particular disinterest in that as an approach for future, more specialist, particular services that are absolutely needed, and there's no lack of belief and certainty of that. I think some of the issues reflect where we feel we have been able to get to with this first round of commissioning. So I guess that's just I'm just trying to give a kind of straightforward.
That's really helpful, Sue, because
why we are where we are.
Sue, that's really helpful because we obviously have been advocating for grants, but we also certainly don't want a situation where organisations think they've got grants, but actually the requirements mean that they're in fact contracts. And it's really reassuring to hear that there does seem to be that there will be more scope for grants in the future where they're more applicable. And I think that's the point we've always made, is that our feeling is that grants should be the default, and then if there's good reason to not use a grant, then fine, but there needs to be a mechanism for making that decision to choose, rather than just assuming that things will always be a contract, which I think in the past in other commissioning rounds we've maybe seen too often than we'd like to. There was also the point around who's involved in the discussions about what is cultural competence, and I think that links to a question Katuna had around who will assess bids and assess whether people meet these general requirements. Katuna, do you want to come in and ask that question?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. I do have a few questions, but I won't go through all of them, and it's not necessary to answer them as well. Just, I know, we can catch up with all of those later on with HMPPS colleagues. However, in relation to who is assessing, I think that's really important, just for transparency and accountability. So it just does not become like tick box exercise that you've got to demonstrate commitment to the LAMI review or any other kind of equality statements, but it's actually somebody who understands these issues and it sits there in the panel, and I think that's kind of really important for organizations who take part, who are not successful, or who don't take part but just are interested really who are part of these panels. So that's really my question.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point. Does anyone from MOJ want to pick up on that?
I can say a little bit about that. So in terms of, we're recruiting now for evaluators for the whole of the dynamic framework competition. We're trying to get specialist input in relation. So the way we've, let me try and explain this simply. It is simple, so I should be able to. So in terms of the evaluation criteria, we've tried to have questions which capture key issues under a single question, and that's partly for simplicity, relative simplicity of completion, but also one of our drivers is that should enable us to, where we have that, to recruit specialist resource to evaluate those questions. So in terms of the overall equalities question, where most of this will be captured under, there's also another question on knowledge and involvement with local organisations, so some of it will be captured under that. So in relation to, headline, the bulk of the evaluation resource will come from our own internal teams, so probation programme teams, broader MOJ, HMPPS specialist teams, and MPS staff groups. So in some senses, the diversity will be as representative, will reflect the overall staff profile of those organisations. It is possible that we can expand evaluation resource to include beyond that, or we can absolutely use people outside of the organisation. Obviously, there's fairly stringent rules in terms of conflict of interest, potentially ever being part of supply chains, etc., and all of that. But there's nothing stopping us expanding in principle, expanding the evaluation resource teams.
That's really helpful, Sue. And I suppose I'm wondering what we might be able to suggest in support, because obviously, we can feed back on how that criteria might be assessed, but I'm also thinking, if most of the evaluation team is drawn from the sort of probation, MOJ, HMPPS workforce, and we know what the diversity makeup of that is, maybe there's opportunities not to bring in organisations that are potentially bidders for these services, but there are, in the voluntary sector space, there are specific BME infrastructure organisations, and then CLINCS as a criminal justice infrastructure organisation, who wouldn't be there competing for services, but might be able to provide some expertise around that. Maybe we can have a further chat about where you might be able to draw support from on that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Thank you.
Sorry, yeah, I think that'd be great, Jess. Sorry, it's Lizzie from
Hi, Lizzie.
MOJ as well. Hello. Yes, I think that'd be a point. So I think it's something that me and Sue have agreed we're going to take away from this. And we've obviously got to balance that these organisations wouldn't be looking to bid, because obviously we've got to have impartial evaluators for the evaluations. But yeah, so it's something me and Sue are going to talk through by the end of this week, and then we can contact you with how we move that forward.
Brilliant. That sounds great.
Thank
we'll keep
you.
Everyone else updated. Sibis Ciso, you had a question about the commissioning. Did the slides explain that question? It was a question from the previous Q&A session. Or do you still have questions?
You mentioned that you're doing a targeted operation model for lived experience, and you're looking forward to draw findings from that. To me, that sounded like you doing a pre-pilot research or something. Is that what you are doing?
Sorry, who mentioned that? Was that? Sorry.
I think that was Abby, wasn't it?
Was it Abby? Sorry, go on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
I know what you're talking about. You're talking about the workshops that MOJ are commissioning around lived experience.
Yes.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Abby, do you want to talk through what that is?
Yeah, I've got really jumpy internet, so I'm just going to talk and then stop, and I'll wait for any feedback, but I can't really do a conversation at the moment because it delays and then it speeds up what everyone's been saying. So at the moment, we CLINCS put out, I think in their light lunch, and we sent out via the HMPPS Service User Advisory Group, the opportunity for a small bit of work to for BAME-led organisations or organisations that work with BAME service users to deliver a focus group or a series of focus groups for us to test and challenge whether the draft target operating model goes far enough to address differential needs and experience of BAME service users in probation. I worry now that maybe that opportunity wasn't spread as widely as it should be if you're only just hearing about it. I'd be really happy to pick that up on a call afterwards. The deadline has passed, but I've been away, so I've spoken to a few organisations about potentially extending that for a few days. You'll be pleased to know that the brief is short and I hope relatively simple. I think it's 2 or 3 sides on a proposal and kind of what costings you would expect from that. I'm really happy to pick that up with you because I think I would like the opportunity to get to as many organisations as we can. As a caveat, it's a relatively small project at this point, which has been led just so that we can feed into the next iteration of the target operating model, which is due to be published in January. But yeah, as I said, happy to pick that up with you because if it's something that you're interested in, we'd be more than happy to hear from you.
Yeah, if people are wondering if they haven't seen that, it was in Light Lunch, I think a fortnight ago, because it was just before you went on leave. Is that right, Abby? So it did go out, so the information is in there. But if
I
people,
think it was a fortnight. Yeah.
If people want it, get in touch, and we can re-forward and put you in touch with Abby, definitely. Sophia, you've got a point about potentially organisations being outbid by larger generic competitors. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I've been involved with some of the women's sectors group throughout COVID, and there's a real panic around the fact that even qualifying, the process is really intense, it's confusing, it can be quite intimidating. But past the qualification stage, a lot of the women's specialists have been concerned that actually they can then be outbid by generic providers or even somebody in the men's sector, whether that's for housing, whether that's for providing services within prisons or in the community. I think something similar might play out with BAME organisations and specialists. Number one, the process is just so intense, and I remember sitting there at certain stages thinking to myself, these are national women's organisations who are finding this process so difficult. What chance do grassroots smaller providers like ourselves, for example, that work with Muslim women prisoners, which is really niche, or the other providers on this call have of, number one, registering and qualifying, and then secondly, being outbid by generic providers? So it just feels like a situation where we are really boxed in. I've seen a comment on there from Katuna. It'd be really interesting to know who has actually qualified from the people on this call. Have people tried to qualify and then pass that stage? If there is no, subcontract for a BAME provider, what is this realistically something that we will be able to compete within?
Thanks, Sophia. And I suppose just to MOJ, in thinking about your response to Sophia, it sparked another question for me, which is, where does a service like Sophia's sit? Because it could both sit in the women's service category need and the BME service category need, and possibly some of the others. And just thinking about that intersection and the risk that it's welcome that we have these different service categories and that we are recognising that there are specific needs for different groups, but we also need to find a way of recognising that those needs intersect and can cut across different areas.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, I think obviously for day one, if you're delivering services to women, then that quite clearly sits within the women's category. So it would be a question of looking for other organisations to partner with in whichever geographic area you are.
Cool. And more generally on Sophia's point about, I mean, I think you've answered this to some extent in your previous responses about, doing what we can to level up the playing field in advance of the competition. But I suppose there is a question for me, which is sort of Sophia's point of the target operating model does specifically acknowledge that there are skills and expertise and experience within the voluntary sector that are specific to certain cohorts. And I feel like there is a tension between that and the procurement and competition rules, because actually if we know that there are specific expertise in a sector for this group, then putting those organisations up against large organisations with big bidding teams then feels to be slightly in tension.
So I would hope that there isn't a tension insofar as the point of the bidding process is so that we find the best organisation. And if you're the best organisation that's got that best experience, then hopefully that will come across. I think obviously we haven't released yet the payment mechanism for women's services or wellbeing services. We have for ETE and the kind of evaluation mechanism, and you will see on there that you know, this is not a contract where money is a significant part of the evaluation. You know, it is primarily focused on quality. So absolutely, and perhaps even more so for the smaller competitions later on, that is absolutely the focus of the evaluation. Regarding the point around kind of big teams in larger organisations having those, I think there is a limit to what we can do as the authority in terms of helping organisations address that. I think, you know, we would like to think we've set the evaluation criteria and we'll carry out the evaluation in a way that it gets to the kind of content of what's there rather than perhaps a polished bid. But I think, I guess if there is demand for advice on bid writing, etc., I think that's probably more an area where clinks would need to provide support than the authority. I just don't think it's something we can do in our position to be providing that. But certainly, I think, you know, please tell us what are the bits that you're worried about, and we can see what we can do to help you get there. I mean, certainly on the qualification process, we've run various webinars, as you know, to answer questions on the bits that people are finding complicated. We can do more of that just for this sector if necessary. So yeah, we are keen to do whatever we can to address any concerns.
Thank you. So I've got 19 messages in the chat and I'm conscious of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and pull out key points that we haven't touched on yet. And Sibusi, so you have a very good point around the Social Value Act and tenders to the value. Do you want to ask your question rather than me reading it out?
Sorry, it's not that I have a lot of questions. I've been just on this journey for 6 years.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with lots of questions or providing your learning to us all. So please go ahead.
So we've been working with the Crown Rep for the voluntary sector, Claire Dove, who wanted to increase the Social Value Act from 10% to 20%. And in that, to include a benchmark that was BME organization specific. I think that has really pushed through government, and therefore we expect to see that filter through with the MOJ. And equally, when it comes to the procurement side, working with Tom's social value portal, we do a lot of matrix and calculations to implement an affirmative action policy. An affirmative action policy does not hinder any of the procurement rules. It just highlights a certain viewpoint about how you want to be supportive towards different groups to be able to win bids. This conversation sounds like it sits more with affirmative action on the basis that you can see what the American program for procurement is, and you can see what the South African program of procurement is. It is saying exactly what is being said here, maybe just not as explicit as that, but I think to be explicit about it would be great, because currently that's what we are doing with the 24 Bisocial Corporate Challenge partners, you know, from PwC to Wilmot Dixon to the SCAPE group. I could name them on. I'll send you the link. So is this a development towards affirmative action? So it is a clear policy within MOJ, because as you're doing the grant scheme, and then you're doing the support, blah, blah, blah. And I think one of the key supports that would be really beneficial through this process, just to add on what Janet was saying, would be a support mechanism to support organizations through the procurement phase. So if someone does win, it is not about can they deliver it at the same quality as a large provider. It's about acknowledging that this is a rare opportunity in what you currently have. How do you nurture and develop this organization to be an example of what the MOJ or your procurement services can actually do to enhance the levels of inequality within the procurement supply chains and the levels of inequality that COVID has shown, and everything else that links within the economic, health, injustice that exists around the world and mainly around the UK. I think beyond just the criminal justice and all of us trying to bid for these services, there are wider issues that we also address through procurement. And we can't negate those issues. So I'm hoping to know or to hear that that is your wider perspective into this conversation.
Thank you. And just to go back to your earlier point about Claire Dove, I'd be really interested to know more about that because from MOJ, because my understanding is that that policy is forthcoming and likely to be implemented. And when I heard that, my first thought was, oh no, it's going to happen. Probation day one services will have already been procured and we're going to miss the opportunity for this. So I don't know if there's any update on that and how that might be taken into account in the programme.
Hey Jess, I'll pick that one up. It's Lizzie. So we are looking at how social value is going to be embedded into the criteria already as it is. We've had quite a mixed conversation on quite a lot of this because quite a lot of the actual criteria that we ask about is actually delivering social value. So a lot of the criteria we naturally ask to deliver these types of services are delivering the very essence of what social value is. And we are looking at whether we actually build in different areas that actually bespokely say the word social value. I am a big believer that social value is much more than just saying those words. It's how do we embed it through the service delivery in every aspect that we actually can. I think that's what we're trying to aim to do. So it has already been considered and is continuing to be considered as we're doing the criteria over the next few weeks for the next lot of call-off competitions.
Okay, thank you. Katuna, you've got a question.
Jess, sorry, thank you. I have quite a lot.
Just go for it.
Can I just quickly mention what's really kind of important point for me? I absolutely agree with Janet that it can't be seen as favoring one group over another, but I said this previously, Jess, when we had discussion, that whilst we're pursuing this equality, we also need to pay attention to equity because not everyone has got the same needs. And I think there is sort of expectancy, if you are a public body, that you would pay attention to certain groups because they might be disadvantaged. And I think that's relevant for BME sector and BME organizations. So I wonder if HMPPS would consider sort of ring fencing portion of funding, because we saw during COVID a lot of organizations and funders kind of allocated certain percentage of their funding and said, if you're BME-led organizations, you felt like almost safeguarded because it obviously would be in unequal footing. So I wonder if this is something which is too radical, but I feel certainly confident in our small group here to ask this radical question for consideration.
I don't think it's radical at all, Katuna. And I think it links to a point I was thinking about. So Temba has made the point that in many ways, the structure of a commissioning process that so excludes BME organisations is in some ways a form of systemic racism in and of itself. And for me, that links to the point about the level playing field. And, you know, yes, there are things that we can do to try and level that playing field out and things that clinics can do, but even doing that requires resource. So where is the resource, either to bring organisations up to the same level as others, or, as Katuna's suggesting, to ring fence resource so that organisations who aren't quite at that level are still able to be involved?
So I think it's absolutely a valid challenge. Certainly, in principle, yes, that's something we can do. It's separate from the kind of how you do a procurement for competition. I think it's definitely something we need to take away and look at. I guess there's two options. One is a kind of pure grant type process of, are you delivering services in this category, and therefore, you know, fill in a kind of grant application and provide funding. The other is more kind of capacity building around making sure that, you know, people get support to get up to the level of being able to bid in future competitions, etc. The first one is probably more simpler around what it means. The second one, it would be good to get more input from you about what exactly you would want and what you'd be looking for. But certainly I think it's something we can take away and think about.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Janet. Des, you had a question around core costs and whether grants would include that. And I know in the contracts that are currently being commissioned, you know, there's significant cost in there around mobilisation and other things. I just wonder whether anyone from MOJ can talk about that split between delivery of service costs and actually costs for organisations that actually support those back office functions, and how that works in the day one contracts and call-offs, but also how you might envisage it working with others.
So if it was a grant, like I've just spoke about a minute ago, then clearly you could do that. You could say, you know, if you are delivering services in this area, then you could include that in the kind of conditions for the grants. In terms of day one services and general competitions that we're likely to run in the framework, you should always be covering your full costs and as part of that bid. We don't expect any organisation to be subsidising the cost of services. There should be full cost recovery, and obviously that includes an element of your kind of back office HQ type costs. So essentially that's for you to think about in terms of your bidding and your costing. Are you, you know, supporting the necessary structure that sits behind the kind of frontline service? I don't know if that answers the question fully.
Can I come back on that just quickly?
Yeah, go on, Des.
That a lot of small grassroots organisations do, and a lot of grants don't allow core costs in the same way. So I appreciate the fact you're saying looking at full cost recovery, but as long as the grants allow that to have in their management costs. Otherwise, again, it's theoretical, but when you get into the operational side of it, it doesn't happen and it doesn't work. And I think that's where a lot of kind of BAME-led small grassroots organisations are. We're talking about them not being able to access contracts. A lot of them live off of grants. And the thing with grants is it's very hard to build things like reserves and to get the full cost recovery. So I think it's really important that if that is going to be said, you've got to be intentional about the structure of that grant that welcomes that. Just very quick thing, very, very quickly. I know we've been talking very much about the procurement process and what is and what isn't allowed under the Equalities Acts 2010, but what we can allow is positive action. And I think as much as a lot have been said, we cannot positively discriminate, what we can do is positively act. And I think that links very much to Sibisu mentioned that point about affirmative action. And I think that's really important. That's it.
Thank you, Des. That's really helpful. So there's quite a lot on the chat in terms of reflections on people's experience of the dynamic framework. And from now, but it's a very relevant question of just out of interest, how many of you have tried to qualify or have qualified? And I wish I could do a poll, but we don't have that function enabled. So I don't know how to, maybe could you give me, the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button, and you can select from that a thumbs up. Could you give me a thumbs up if you have tried to qualify? Okay,
yes, I can do a poll.
Can you?
Yeah.
So quickly do a poll on, have you tried to qualify and have you been successful in qualifying? And while Helen's setting that up, has anyone got any reflections on that process?
I've got a reflection. We're trying at the moment. It is very complex. I think unless you've got a team working with you, if you're a small grassroots charity and it's you and possibly a bid writer, I mean, I've got a bid writer working with me who does a lot of dynamic framework stuff. And she's found it very, very cumbersome, complex and hard. Yeah, so thus far we haven't submitted the SQ yet, but just getting to that is loads of work.
Yeah,
we can definitely run a session if it would be helpful in terms of the process and kind of talk organisations generally through that process, if that's helpful.
I was going to yeah, I was about to say, so I've only recently started on a lot of this, so I do apologise, but we can do anything. I'm quite a big believer that we need to help this market get on board with this for day one and day two moving forward. And I appreciate, so I'm a procurement person and I've come in and I've seen these documents and I appreciate they are not the simplest of documentation to go through. I appreciate the system is not the simplest. I already have a long list for when we've completed day one services of tweaks that I want to make to this process for day two to try and encourage and ensure that we can make it as simple as possible, while also I do have to have my procurement hat on and have to follow the regulations, the legal guidance that we need to follow. So I'm very open to where the struggles are. I want to know those. I'm happy, Jess, if you want to actually pass my email address round, completely happy for anybody to actually provide me with those struggles. I can't say that I can rectify them for day one on the basis that we are at the resource and we are at the stage that we're at. But my role is going to be continuing for day two services. So I'm going to be part of the team that helps deliver and support day two services. I've got a permanent job in this team, not just a programme delivery one. So a lot of what I want to try and do is how do we make sure that makes a difference?
That's really helpful, Lizzie. And I suppose what that...
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I've actually taken part on the dynamic framework. And what I found was a number of aspects that are challenging. So the way the framework was put together, brilliant. I think it's very good that they need that information, and I can see how that information is useful. The problem is the nature of the type of information that they want really discriminates a lot of organizations. Even if you're looking at the figures that they want, the cutoff points, you can see that a lot of organizations are grassroots. So automatically they don't actually qualify. They don't sit anyway in terms of the amounts that they're bidding for. The other problem that you have, the technical aspect of it, is, for example, you've got optional questions. So to me, optional means you can answer or you cannot answer. It shouldn't affect your submitting the bid. But in this case, you know, I ran out of time because actually it would not allow me to submit the bid because there were some optional questions, which were quite a lot of them, that I had not answered. So even though I sent an email saying this is the situation that I was in, that situation was not resolved. It was, you didn't submit on time, you're out. Then you've got the other situation on the grants. Again, you know, there are quite a number of challenges technically in terms of, you know, submission, where there's no flexibility. Whether you are a minute or 2 minutes, you know, late, that's it, you're out. So those are some of the challenges that you find when you're working and you're a small organization. You don't have a team of people who deal with these things. You might be the only person who's got to, you know, do all the paperwork, put things together, and that's just a lot. So that's the feedback I can give in terms of that.
No, that is really, really good feedback. So thank you.
I'm just looking at the poll results because I think it's quite pertinent to what you've just shared, Temba. So, and obviously, you know, I'm aware that this is a small sample, but 12 organisations have answered this, and if it helps to give an idea, we think we have a list of about 30-ish organisations who we know are sort of active in working in the probation and prison space, who are Black and minority ethnic led, because the sector has sort of been reduced so much over the years. So it's a small sample, but in many ways it's probably quite a significant sample of the amount of organisations that are there. And obviously this poll's showing that only one of you, so about half of you have tried to qualify, just under, and only one organisation so far has been successful and 9 not. So I think that is quite concerning. I'm wondering, Temba, particularly for your specific issues, Lizzie, would you be okay if I put you and Temba in touch with each other?
Yeah, a lot of the stuff is on my list, just so that you know. Temba is around actually the system and how it pushes you through certain aspects of that system is on. I'll really honestly, because of timings and resource, there's not much I can do in day one because they're already set up in the system. But we think for day 2 there's a good review that I'll be able to do on how that system flows, and I'd expect for us to be able to do some workshops around that to actually say, I'm thinking this because I'm a procurement person, but actually what's this mean for you and how does it flow through? I think there is some areas we can develop.
And hopefully what that means is there's an opportunity for the qualification process to be looked at again before that BAME service category is commissioned. So actually, I mean, it doesn't help for those of you who are interested in delivering any of those day 1 service categories, but certainly for the BAME service category, that might help. There's a couple of...
Just so you know, we can't radically change the whole thing, but I can make the tweaks that I think from what you've just said there would make it so that the system allows that kind of thing to actually happen.
Yeah, and just on that point of radically changing the whole thing, we at Clinks, we're conscious that the system MOJ use is in some ways out of their control. It's a cross-governmental move to use systems like this, but we are talking to other infrastructure organisations in the voluntary sector about how we might collectively push back on that move a little bit and highlight the issues that it causes for our sector. We are going to have to wrap up, but before we do, I just wanted to mention that, so a few people have put in the chat suggestions for the kind of support that might be useful. And we're continuing to talk to MOJ and HMPPS about that and how that might be delivered. So we'll feed in those comments to that. And Katina in particular has asked if Clinks can act as essentially as the infrastructure organisation for you all, specifically on the issues around being BAME-led, obviously with the infrastructure organisation for the criminal justice sector. And I just wanted to highlight the work that we are doing around that at the moment. So many of you will have received an email from Anne Fox, our CEO, a few weeks ago, when we published a blog that announced that we wanted to work towards becoming an anti-racist organisation in all that we do and say. So we acknowledge that most of our work in addressing racial inequality up until now has probably been focused on influencing, and we want to extend that across all parts of the organisation. So we are now looking at some work to take that forward, which both includes looking at our sort of internal processes and procedures, but also other parts of our work with organisations, and that includes setting up a BAME criminal justice network, much in the sort of guise of our women's network, so that we can bring you together more regularly, talk about these issues, and make sure that we're representing these issues and supporting you in them. So we're trying to do it as quickly as possible. It's obviously taking a bit of time, and you know, bear with us, but we recognise the urgency of it, and have wanted to do this for a long time, so we're very excited to do so. So watch this space. And on that note, Whitney, can you put your comment in the chat and we'll make sure we share it? I'm sorry, I don't have time to come to you, but if you put your comment in the chat, we're going to record all the comments. Is that all right? Brilliant, thanks. So I just want to say thank you to you all for joining. I hope it's been useful. If you've got any further questions about any of this, we have a dedicated email address for queries around the probation review, which is probation@clinks.org. Please do send anything in and we'll try and help where we can. And if we can't help, we'll direct the question to MOJ. And I think Helen has been chatting to you all about sharing contact details, and we'll share the slides. And this whole Zoom webinar will be up on the website in due course as well. So please let others know who weren't able to make it that they can get this information there. Okay, thanks very much.